During a weekend in which Verstappen qualified on the front row and comfortably won the race after a brilliant overtake on Oscar Piastri for the lead, and also now has closed the gap in the championship to just 22 points, it was yet another disappointing weekend on the other side of the garage for Yuki Tsunoda. After a big crash in Q1, which is going to have major cost cap implications already, he was able to recover from the pit lane to P10 with a clean drive. But yet again, for what feels like the 100th time in the past 6 years, it was not the weekend that either Red Bull or Yuki needed, especially with Max winning the race at the front. Yuki has now had 5 races in the Red Bull, having taken over from Lawson after just 2 races into the season, and he is still not even close to challenging for the podium. And now, the circumstances under which Yuki was promoted into Red Bull weren't exactly ideal, given that he started the season at RB and didn't even get to do preseason testing in the RB21. But having said that, even though 5 races is not a big sample size, it does give us a decent amount of data to now look back at where Yuki is right now and how he compares to the growing list of Red Bull second drivers before him. In this video, I'm going to compare his first 5 races to Gasly, Perez and Lawson when they started the season for Red Bull, as well as Albon, who joined midway through his rookie season and who I guess is slightly more comparable to Yuki, who jumped in after 2 races. And now, when it comes to these stats, I am going to be doing a ranking of the 5 drivers and where they were after the first 5 races. And keep in mind, of course, that Liam Lawson didn't even make it to 5 races, so he is a little bit of an outlier compared to the rest. But the thing that really stands out is not necessarily that Alex Albon, as a rookie midway through his rookie season, was able to score 48 points in his first 5 races for Red Bull, but it's the fact that Yuki so far has only scored 7 points compared to Gasly's 21 after 5 races in 2019. And at the time in 2019, that was seen as a disaster when Gasly replaced Ricciardo, but comparing it now to 2025, I think the team would absolutely love for Yuki to even have 21 points to his name at this point in the season. And next up, we have the average race position. Now, of course, this ranking is exactly the same as the points scored because there is a direct correlation between where you finish and how many points you score, but the reason why I wanted to show this is that when you look at Albon and Perez, as much as they struggled from the moment that they got into that Red Bull, and of course there was that acclimatization period, they were basically podium threats at the very least from the moment that they stepped into that car. When you look at Tsunoda in particular, he has struggled to even get inside the top 10, and his average race position has barely been a point-scoring one. It just shows and it just clarifies even more how much harder the drivers are struggling in the ground effect era compared to the pre-2022 cars. And next up, we have the qualifying deficit to Max Verstappen, and this is the first comparison that we can make to the benchmark driver that is Max. Now, the reality is that every single one of these times is unacceptable. I mean, even being 4/10 away from your teammate, even in your first 5 races, is unacceptable under any circumstance, even for a rookie, to be honest. So it just shows how much the drivers are struggling, especially in qualifying, and that is the main issue that I'm going to get into a little bit later in the video. But when you look at the fact that Gasly is actually the closest to Verstappen in his first 5 races, and it just gets worse and worse and worse basically as the years go on, apart from Alex Albon, who has, to be honest, a few outliers, because there was one race where Max wasn't even in qualifying, and there was another one where Alex crashed very early on and didn't even set a time. So his 1.1 seconds is a little bit of an outlier. But that gap in terms of the qualifying gap to Max has only gotten bigger as Max has become more experienced, more accomplished, and even more comfortable with the car over the years. Last up, we have average qualifying position, which, to be honest, is probably the most important and the one that stands out the most when it comes to why that second Red Bull is struggling as much as it is. For the last half-decade, we have seen Max Verstappen every single weekend challenging for pole, challenging for the front row, and at least from there, he can fight for the race win. When you look at his teammates, how many times have we seen them be knocked out in Q2 or just on the limit of Q3? How many times have we even seen them be knocked out of Q1? As you can see, Perez stands head and shoulders above everyone else as being comfortably inside of the top 10 in terms of his average qualifying position. But when it comes to Gasly, Albon, Tsunoda and Lawson in their first 5 races, they already started their Red Bull careers on the back foot, just chasing points, let alone podiums. And in an era where overtaking just seems more and more difficult, the emphasis on qualifying is becoming more and more important. And the fact that all of them were starting outside of the top 10 on average in the first 5 races, they started on the back foot, and regardless of how many races they got, it kind of didn't really get any better for any of them. Imola was the first race of the season where you could genuinely argue that the Red Bull was better than the McLaren. In qualifying, as has been the case all season long, the front of the grid was ludicrously tight. However, in the race, even Max admitted at being surprised by how well the Red Bull was able to look after its tyres and how much he was able to push the Red Bull as well. The fact is that in every single stint, Max was able to easily pull away from the McLarens, and it makes it all the more frustrating that on a weekend where Red Bull genuinely had the fastest car, Yuki was yet again on a recovery drive at the back of the grid. This weekend at Imola was always going to be an important test for Yuki because not only did Red Bull bring a brand new upgrade package onto the car, but Yuki himself has raced and tested around Imola loads of times when he was back in the Racing Bulls. When you combine that previous experience with car performance, it really becomes a weekend of what could have been for Yuki. But it's clear as day, judging from the crash, that whilst Yuki definitely doesn't lack any commitment to push the car to its limits, using that much curb on your first run in Q1, which by the way was way more curb than even Piastri used on his pole lap, it was just asking to end up in a crash. It wasn't even a case of that he couldn't extract the performance out of the car, it was simply a case of driver error by pushing way too hard, way too soon, and asking the car to do something that was simply impossible. Luckily for Yuki, his recovery drive on the Sunday was actually pretty good given that around a track that's notoriously difficult to overtake on, he managed to overtake half the grid coming from the pit lane. He was one of the very few drivers to make a one-stop work with multiple VSCs and safety cars that played into his favour, and that confidence that he will hopefully be able to take from the race is going to be massively important because the next race is going to be in Monaco. That is definitely a race where you need to have confidence in your car, you need to have confidence in yourself, and you cannot be shunting it into the barrier in Q1 and ruining your weekend from there. Compared to the likes of Perez and even Gasly, Yuki's points tally after 5 races has been even more disappointing than what I expected, which to be honest is all that really matters. I feel like our expectations are now so low and we have become so accustomed to the second Red Bull driver struggling as much as they have been, that it's hard to even imagine the second Red Bull even getting close to challenging for the podium, looking at how competitive it is between Max, George and the 2 McLaren drivers up at the front. There is no doubt that Max Verstappen is a better driver now compared to when his previous teammates were at Red Bull, because let's not forget, even when Perez joined Red Bull in 2021, Max Verstappen still hadn't even won a World Championship year. Having said that, the Red Bull this season, in the hands of Max at least, is clearly better than it was in 2019 when Gasly and Albon made their Red Bull debuts. However, it seems like even though it's more competitive, it's also got a lot more difficult to drive. That's what makes comparing what Yuki has done to Gasly and Albon so difficult, because the car is clearly better, Max is clearly better, which in itself complicates the picture, and yet Yuki's results so far have been significantly worse compared to his predecessors. Something that complicates the situation even more for Yuki is that, on top of having to compete with the likes of his teammates, the McLarens, the Mercedes and the Ferraris, Williams this season have not only improved their car to become a consistent points contender, but with Albon and Sainz, despite a little bit of tension already at the team, they are delivering consistent points finishes, and as we saw last time out, they are even now challenging for the podium. I don't think that Yuki, when he joined Red Bull, would have anticipated that Williams would be as much of a factor as they are in the fight for podiums, but as things stand at the moment, he can't even beat them, let alone the traditional top 4 teams. One common theme across Gasly, Albon, Perez, Lawson and Tsunoda is that their number one struggle, as I mentioned earlier, even in their first 5 races, has come in qualifying. When you take all of the fuel out of the car and have to push it to its limits, that is where you've got to be in perfect harmony with the car physically and with yourself mentally to have the confidence to be able to push it. When it comes to the race, it's normal to see the second Red Bull gain positions across the race and work its way back through the field. But that is just a consolation prize at the end of the day, because it means that you're never in a position to be challenging the people you're supposed to be challenging in the first place. The truth is that there is not even a single shred of evidence to suggest that so far Yuki will be a success at Red Bull, and what exactly even constitutes a success at this point is hard to even comprehend. Looking at the standings, given that Red Bull have a race-winning car and a championship contending car, you've got to say that second in the constructors has to be their target, with them currently being 16 points behind Mercedes in second place. If there was one positive, which I do want to pick out because I don't want this video to be just entirely negative, is that especially when you look at Gasly, Lawson, and even Albon, more so in 2020 rather than when he made his debut in 2019, those drivers mentally looked dejected even after 5 races. Gasly was having internal friction within the team, Albon very early into 2020 looked like a deer in the headlights, and even Lawson, as we saw at the beginning of the season, he just looked like all of his soul was sucked out of his body. Yuki, I think, due to his experience, which is more similar to Perez at this stage of his career, has this fighting mentality and fighting spirit, knowing what's happened to the drivers before him, which at least gives me more hope at this stage compared to the likes of Gasly, Albon, and Lawson. The reality is that quality drivers, even in difficult environments, are able to hit the ground running and at least show some signs of potential for the future, but I honestly think that when it comes to Red Bull, what they really need is to just ride out 2025 with a little bit of consistency in their driver lineup and hope that the 2026 generation of cars, which are still going to be somewhat similar to what we have now, at least introduces some kind of reset for their second driver. The disparity between how competitive Max is in that Red Bull relative to what the second driver is able to get out of it has just become a joke at this point. These are not useless drivers that Red Bull are putting into their cars. I mean, look at what Albon is doing right now in the Williams. The problem that Red Bull now have is that there is literally no other alternatives. Even if Yuki continues to plateau being a borderline Q3 qualifier and scoring single-digit points, what exactly do Red Bull do? All of a sudden Marco is starting to talk up Hadjar, the driver who he said was an embarrassment after Australia, but do we really need to guess what will happen if Hadjar replaces Yuki mid-season? Nothing good is going to come out of fast-tracking Lindblad into Formula 1 when he turns 18 this summer, and because all of the other top established drivers have already locked themselves into long-term contracts, no one is even available for 2026. Although Yuki has made mistakes and is certainly under-delivering, let's not forget that had it not been for RB's strategical incompetence in Australia and his front wing failing in China, he would have started the season with back-to-back points finishes. This isn't a driver who's incapable of scoring points, but his progress and adaptation over the first 5 races in the RB21 has been disappointing to say the least, and unfortunately, even as a Yuki fan, as much as I would love to say the opposite, there is just no reason to suggest that, so far with the current concept of car, that Yuki will ever be able to get even close to fulfilling his potential at Red Bull with the talent that we know that he has. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video, then don't forget to subscribe. That would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.